Okay, in this presentation, we're going to talk about 15 objections to the resurrection of Jesus. Of course, the resurrection is the central tenet of our faith, and there have been several objections to the resurrection of Jesus for several decades. Of course, there are some newer ones, and I hope to be very thorough in this presentation, so I hope you have some time to sit back and take some notes because there's a lot to it. This was done in conjunction with our apologetics ministry at The Ohio State University here in Columbus, Ohio. Now, when it comes to having knowledge about God and talking to people about whether you can know there's a God, and all the agnostics out there that say you can't know, or I don't know how to know, there's definitely several ways you can approach the existence of God. First and foremost, of course, there's natural theology, and that's where we try to reason that there is a God in the world of nature. Sometimes these play out in philosophical arguments and other arguments, but the point is natural theology does not rely on history or the Bible. It just looks at the world of nature alone, or other things, features of reality in a philosophical sense, and so that is one way people approach the existence of God. Of course, there's many books on natural theology you can get. And then number two, of course, historical arguments for God's existence are what we're dealing with in this presentation, where we talk about history and whether God has spoken in the world of history, and that's what we believe, of course, has happened with the resurrection of Jesus. And then when it comes to number three, science or empirical arguments, there's an ongoing debate whether we can use science as a method to find God's existence. Of course, there's a big debate how to define science and whether science is a study of natural causes alone. And then we get into the intelligent design debate, which is ongoing. And then when it comes to abduction or inference, the best explanation, that's where we look at features of reality, such as in the sciences or history. And then we make an inference to what is the best explanation, explains all the data there. And then for some people, pragmatic benefit is all that matters. All they care about is whether what they believe about their faith, or their faith makes a difference in their life, it works for them, and therefore God exists because they've seen how God works in their lives. Mormons do it, Muslims do it, Christians do it, Jewish people do it. Everybody does that with their faith. It's not that faith doesn't have a pragmatic element, but it's tricky to say it's only true because of pragmatic benefit. And then number six, you have experientialism or subjectivism, where people think or know that God exists through religious experience, where they've had an encounter with God and they think that God is real because of that experience. Nothing wrong with that, but it gets kind of tricky when you have a lot of different religions claiming to have religious experiences, or people having religious experiences, and when they all contradict each other. And then we have the existential approach, which talks about how God explains existential questions. He's the best explanation for our deepest longings for things like purpose, meaning in life, and so that is the existential approach. So in this presentation, we're mostly dealing with history. Now remember, if people are only on a happiness quest and not a truth quest, all you can really say, if it turns out that Jesus is who he is and he really rose from the dead, then it's going to be true tomorrow, 5 days from now, or 50 years from now. And that's because your happiness does not determine the facts of history. So whether you're doing well in life or whether you're happy has no bearing on whether Jesus rose from the dead. He either rose from the dead or he didn't rise from the dead, and that is a historical claim we're making, so you can stay busy and try to ignore it, but whether he rose and whether it's true, and if it is true, it's going to be true today, tomorrow, or the next day, 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. So just remember that. Now, some people who follow Jesus may ask, well, why should we care about history? You know, what does it matter? We have the Holy Spirit. Well, remember that we believe our faith is anchored in a God who acts in history, especially in remarkable events such as the exodus of the Jews from Egypt, or the events of the New Testament. And if we don't have any historical verification, we need to ask, what's the difference between our faith and Mormonism, Islam, or something else? And that is very true. And as James Charlesworth says here, blind faith without any historical knowledge is not the faith in Jesus we find in the evangelists and Paul. And Bart Ehrman even says something I agree with there. He says anyone should be able to see whether a historical claim has merit or is pure fantasy driven by an ideological or theoretical desire for a certain set of answers to be right. So we need to understand historical knowledge matters. And then if someone says, I have the Holy Spirit, that's all that matters. I experience God when I read the Bible. I experience it in my prayer life. Just remember, unless Jesus rose from the dead in time, space, and history, you don't have the Holy Spirit, because if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, he cannot ascend to the Father, and he cannot send the Holy Spirit. So you're already relying on a form of testimonial evidence, and you're relying on the memories of those who wrote and recorded the events in the Bible. So you do have a form of evidence you're relying on. This is a very important quote here. These authors say right here, with regard to the past, one cannot empirically prove a historical event in the same way in which one proves a mathematical equation, or verifies that someone is 6 feet tall or has blue eyes through historical evidence, though historical evidence can point strongly in one direction. Historical truths are tested by assessing hypotheses in view of the evidence and then accepting the hypothesis that best explains the evidence. And that's what we're going to be doing this presentation, talking about the different hypotheses that have been put out there for several decades, and ask, what is it that, what hypothesis explains the evidence better than the other ones? So anyone can throw out any of these naturalistic hypotheses out there. These are the different ones that have been put out over the decades and centuries. Of course, you'd have to go into great detail to explain each one. I'm going to go over some of these today. I'm not going to go over all of them, but the point is that anyone is welcome to throw these out there and we can debate them and talk about them, but they need to be able to explain all the relevant data. And of course, some of these are ongoing as far as the debate about them, but these are some of the most common ones on the bottom here that people throw out there to explain all the data about the resurrection. And remember a couple things here. These two terms are very important. Explanatory power is how well an explanation explains something, while explanatory scope is how much an explanation explains something. So we need to ask which hypothesis explains all the data, and how well it explains the data, of course, how much it explains. And so that's what we're going to be doing here. So let's look at the first one, called the Legends hypothesis. And in this hypothesis, it states that the New Testament accounts of the disciples who gave the testimonies about the appearances are all legends, and they were invented much later. This is very common, and then they say that Paul's letters, while they are the earliest documents, lead to a later development, as we see in the Gospels. But of course, the Gospels are written after Paul's letters, which we'll talk about. They claim that we see some sort of legendary development about the resurrection. And if you want to get a book that talks about the early proclamation, or the oral tradition, or the early traditions, or the creedal statements that were passed on very early in the faith before they were written down, this is an excellent book called From Good News to the Gospels by David Wenham. What did the first Christians say about Jesus? That's what he talks about, the oral phase and how it relates to the written phase of the gospel proclamation. Also, if you want to get Eric Eve's book, Behind the Gospels, Understanding the Oral Tradition, he talks about the different kinds of oral tradition models. There's no doubt that Jesus is seen as a rabbi and teacher in the Gospels, and Jesus taught things orally. Jesus was definitely a passionate guardian of the Torah. He explained and expounded on the Torah. But the point is that the story of Jesus was passed on orally. It was an oral testimony before it was written down. Now, we don't have access to the oral phase of Jesus. All we have is a written phase, but before anything's written down, it's passed on orally. And so whatever was preached about Jesus' resurrection would have been transmitted orally before it was even written down. Paul's letters are the earliest sources we have for the resurrection of Jesus. They're dated between 48 and somewhere around 65 to 70 AD. But the point is that whatever Paul received in those letters, he received it earlier. He got his information about Jesus before he even wrote that down. That means he would have had to receive that information somewhere between 30 and 40 AD, because Jesus is dated as being crucified in 33 AD, and Paul would have had to come to faith somewhere between 30 and 40, and then he wrote down his letters after that. And so whatever Paul wrote about the resurrection in his letters, that would have had to be received at even an earlier date before he wrote them down. Even Bart Ehrman, who is a skeptic, he agrees that there are the undisputed letters, that Paul definitely wrote those letters. I'm no doubt that I think Paul wrote all his letters. But the point is that even if you look at the undisputed letters, we see that Paul talks about the resurrection of Jesus in them, and that means he received that information before he even wrote them down. For example, one of the most common things that we talk about is the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul says he received this information at an earlier date, or he says he received this information, but the word receive means he received it from somebody else, from an oral transmission, and we know that 1 Corinthians 15 is dated at 55 AD, and so that means this creedal information about Jesus' resurrection had to be received even before that, most likely in Jerusalem when Paul went to visit Peter there, because he mentions Peter's name in the creed. So the point is that Paul's information is received much earlier, and it's very hard to say there's some sort of legendary development even going on because it was received so early. And then this is a little timeline about the New Testament sources here. You see here that, as I said, all Paul's letters are received back somewhere between 30 and 40, because he wrote most of his letters between 48 and 65, at least that's when they're dated. He would have received that resurrection creed in 1 Corinthians 15 somewhere between 30 and 40 AD. So that's just a little timeline of the New Testament. Now, some people say that Paul's letters, when you look at where he talks about the resurrection body, especially in 1 Corinthians 15, maybe he's talking about a spiritual Jesus, not a physical resurrection, that Jesus was raised spiritually. And then maybe what we see is a legendary development where it starts out spiritual and then maybe it goes to more of a physical resurrection. But I think what you will see is that Paul's letters do speak of a physical resurrection. They're in perfect harmony with the four Gospels. There is an article online you can read here by Kurt McGregor. It's called 1 Corinthians 15 and the Bodily Resurrection of Jesus. You can just type that in and read it. I think he makes a pretty good exegetical argument that Paul did argue for a physical resurrection, and it's not in opposition with the Gospels. Okay, so the point is that it's too early. Paul's letters are too early to argue for some sort of legendary development, and I think that argument is fairly weak at this point. Let's look at the second objection. Second objection, we don't have direct evidence. We can't interview the witnesses, and it's all hearsay evidence. That means that we can't go back and talk to the witnesses. We can't interview them in a courtroom setting. We weren't there. We didn't see it directly. So therefore, it's really hard to know what happened. And we just can't trust the New Testament. And so that's settled. So that's another objection that's out there. We need to remember that there are these three categories, as James Warner Wallace talks about, that we see these in the Gospels. You see things such as what's called firsthand experience, where there are witnesses that describe events and occurrences that they personally experienced. You also see some sort of firsthand access that those who wrote the Gospels include descriptions of events and occurrences they may have not personally observed directly, but they're aware on the basis of information given to them by someone else at that time. That's probably Luke, because Luke doesn't claim to be a direct witness, and of course Mark gets a lot of his information from Peter, whereas there's an argument that can be made Matthew and John are direct eyewitnesses. And then you have firsthand knowledge, and that's where eyewitnesses include descriptions of general cultural conditions and truths that were part of the common knowledge of the time, even though they had no direct experience or observation upon which they rely. And so these three categories must be taken into account whenever you're talking about eyewitness testimony or looking into the past or the present. Now, if you want direct evidence, you're asking for something that is unattainable. Of course, we do not have direct evidence for the resurrection or anything in the Bible, or for that matter, a lot of things in antiquity or a lot of things in science, because we were not there to directly observe it. In the sciences and even in cold case investigations for detectives, they weren't there to see the body get killed or anything. Or in historical evidence as well, we have to rely on circumstantial evidence, and that means that when we go into a court of law, of course, cold case detectives can use circumstantial evidence. It is admissible. And we need to understand in science, we were not there to see the beginning of the universe. We were not there to see how life began. We were not there to see a lot of things, but we make the inferences to the best explanation on what we have. And so for some people to say they need to have direct evidence and then they're off the hook in studying the resurrection, it just doesn't work that way. You have to be open to look at circumstantial evidence in a lot of things. So why apply it to other things but not the resurrection? Just doesn't make any sense. And as I said, science studies things in the past. In many cases, they were not there to empirically verify the event of which they're studying. And as I said, they come up with what they think is the most reasonable inference, which is based on the data. And of course, the same things happened in history. The same thing happens in history as well. All right, third objection, the false testimonies hypothesis. This says that the disciples, the apostles fabricated the resurrection story. That means they lied about it and made it up. And it is true that people fabricate things, but the question is, what is the motive? And as James Warner Wallace says in his book, Cold Case Christianity, he has investigated he's done many cold case investigations, many murder investigations, many other cases where he has seen people lie, and he says the three main motives for why people lie are financial gain, sexual or relational desire, or the pursuit of power. And we need to always ask, what would be the motive for the disciples to lie about the resurrection story or to fabricate it? So we need to look here. If we apply these three things to the motives for the disciples, we need to ask if we see any evidence that they gained anything financially by preaching the resurrection. As far as we know, the New Testament doesn't show they gained anything financially. They obviously were on their feet, traveling location to location, leaving their home and families, abandoning things behind. We don't see any evidence they got any financial gain. As far as sexual gain, definitely the opposite in the New Testament. The New Testament speaks many times to purity and chastity. So not a lot of evidence they gained any kind of sexual benefit from lying about the resurrection. Not a lot of evidence they gained power. Now, of course, when the faith started out, it was just a Jewish sect at that time. That means that it wasn't a full-blown world religion called Christianity, like what came later on. Because, of course, later on, Christianity became a state-sponsored religion in the 4th century, and Constantine made it into a state religion. And, of course, there was power at the popes and political gain and things like that. But there's no evidence that the early believers, when they started out, gained any kind of power. We can just look at Paul's testimony right here. He says here, 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked, etc., etc., etc. Paul talks about the persecution he went under. So the point is that there's not a lot of motive for them to lie. Now, of course, people do lie about things, religious beliefs. We see that with 9/11. They definitely thought it was true at 9/11 when they did that with knocking down the 2 towers in New York. People do that all the time. They may think something's true, but why do they think it's true? For the disciples, at least were saying that they thought they saw a raised Jesus, and that's the reason they proclaimed it. So there wasn't a lot of motive for them to lie. Now, you can get Sean McDowell's book, The Fate of the Apostles, examining the martyrdom accounts of the closest followers of Jesus. That was his dissertation, where he talks about the motives for the disciples proclaiming Jesus, the martyrdom issue. And so if you want to go deeper on that, you might want to get his book there. Okay, let's look at objection number 4. The resurrection story is invented from other dying and rising God stories. Of course, this has been on the internet forever. A lot of people assume the resurrection account was borrowed from other past myths or dying and rising God stories and other literature. But we need to ask, first of all, would Paul and the other Second Temple Jews at that time who recite the creed, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one," be so quick to base the Jesus story after mythological constructs? I mean, we need to understand that mixing Israel's religion with other mythological constructs is a form of idolatry. Of course, the Jewish scriptures forbid anyone worshiping anyone other than the God of Israel. You also have a chronological issue. We need to ask whether the Jews, after purging so much idolatry out of their faith, would be so quick to just punt back to idolatry by mixing in mythological constructs and mythological figures or legendary figures into their faith. We know that idolatry, of course, is condemned in the New Testament. And we also know that Boyd and Eddy in their book, The Jesus Legend, A Case for Historical Reliability of the Gospels, talk about this in greater detail. And they say similarity is not the same thing as sameness. Parallel terms do not equal parallel concepts. And so that means just because there's other terminology and other faiths or other backgrounds or other polytheistic deities such as Son of God or virgin births or things like that, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the same concept as the Jews are using in the New Testament accounts. And as I say here, we also need to talk about the false cause fallacy. How in the world do we know that they exist side by side to each other? And what evidence do we have the New Testament authors had access to those stories? And what evidence do we have that the one caused the other? It's kind of speculative. It's just assumption. And then this book right here by this Swedish scholar, Mettinger, he said this right here back when he wrote his book, The Riddle of the Resurrection, Dying and Rising Gods in the Ancient Near East. He says the death and rising gods were closely related to the seasonal cycle. Their death and return were seen as reflected in the changes of plant life. The death and resurrection of Jesus is a one-time event and not repeated and unrelated to seasonal changes. There is, as he says, as far as I am aware, no prima facie evidence that the death and resurrection of Jesus is a mythological construct, drawing on the myths and rites and the dying and rising gods of the surrounding world. While study with profit against the background of Jewish resurrection belief, the faith in the death and resurrection of Jesus retains its unique character in the history of religions. A riddle remains. So there are many, many videos on this online. There's been a lot of responses to this. The only people that really put this stuff forward are people online. And so if you want to go deeper on that, I'm sure you can find something. But I don't think that this objection holds any water anymore. Some people may still want to run with it, but I think that's mostly online skeptics. Okay, objection number 5. The disciples, the apostles, had visionary experiences. That means that they had some sort of visionary encounter about Jesus, but that doesn't mean they actually experienced a physical raised Jesus. Like Jesus was not a physical being that appeared to them. It was more or less a visionary experience. So here we get into the issue of the appearances and the nature of the appearances of Jesus to the disciples. So most scholars agree with the following minimal fact. That means that there's not a lot of dispute about these issues. The fact that Jesus' disciples sincerely believed he rose and appeared to them, including Paul and James and as well. Number 2, the disciples were transformed from frightened, hiding individuals to bold witnesses of the resurrection. This is established by the primary evidence. And of course, there's written tradition, including the works of apostolic and early church fathers about this as well. So let me just go ahead and provide a few quotes here. For example, Paula Fredrickson, she is not a follower of Jesus. She is a New Testament scholar. But she says here, I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw. But I do know as an historian they must have seen something. Bart Ehrman, of course, actually he's an atheist now, not even really agnostic. I think he calls himself an atheist. He says, we can say with complete certainty that some of the disciples at some time later insisted that he soon appeared to them, convincing them that he'd been raised from the dead. And then we have E.P. Sanders saying that Jesus' followers and later Paul had resurrection experiences is in my judgment in fact. What the reality was that gave rise to experience, I do not know. So here we have the different resurrection appearances. They're in various locations to various groups to individuals throughout Paul's letters and the Gospels and the book of Acts. We see here, of course, that there's, that is part of the faith. The early faith is claimed that they physically saw, or they saw Jesus after he rose from the dead. So there's not a lot of debate among scholarship that the disciples had experience of the risen Jesus that transformed their life. They just don't necessarily agree on what the disciples actually experienced or what they saw. The visionary experiences that we're talking about here, we'll look at that first here, then we'll look at apparitions. But there's no doubt that many scholars have always said the disciples had visionary experiences of Jesus. Marcus Borg was one. He passed away a few years ago. He was part of the non-Orthodox group, the Jesus Seminar. He says there are the followers of Jesus, both then and now, continue to experience Jesus as a living reality after his death. In the early Christian community, these experiences included visions and apparitions of Jesus. I'll talk about apparitions in a minute. Then we have Ehrman again saying that the visions can account for the resurrection appearances. He says he doesn't care whether they're objective or subjective, veridical or non-veridical. he doesn't really care what the exact nature of the visions are, but he just claims that they had some sort of visionary experience. And then we have Gerd Ludemann, who said he was an atheist. He's an atheist. He says visions reinforced the disciples' enthusiasm, which was contagious and led to many more visions until we have an appearance to more than 500 people. So the problem with the word vision is that it's vague. When people say they had visions, it has to be defined. We need to ask whether they mean they're objective visions, which is something that it would exist outside their minds, or a subjective vision, which is a product of their minds. So if you do say the visions were objective, we could still say that these scholars are saying that the disciples saw a real physical Jesus. It doesn't cast a lot of doubt on Jesus' physical resurrection, but if they say they're subjective visions, and that's going to mean that they really did not see a physical raised Jesus. And remember, the two words that are used for resurrection in the New Testament both imply a physical body. It's pretty clear when you read the New Testament that when Paul and the apostles talk about visions, they seem to know the difference between visions and the physical nature of the resurrection appearances. So I would be first to agree that the New Testament does argue for visions. There are visions all throughout the New Testament, the book of Acts and elsewhere, but I do not think that the apostles nor Paul really describe Jesus' resurrection the same manner. That's just a vision. So we need to ask someone when they talk about visionary experiences how they're defining visions. It's very important. That's the key to clarify that. We know that when it comes to the empty tomb, we see that in the Gospels, the same physical body that was placed in the empty tomb permanently vacated it 3 days later. We know that Jesus said his resurrection body had flesh and bones. He was not a spirit, but had a real flesh and bones. He was raised in the flesh in the book of Acts, in Acts 2:31. And we see that Jesus' resurrection had physical wounds. Of course, Thomas could touch his wounds. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize when you read the Gospels that they all seem to imply Jesus is a physical raised Jesus, and it can be verified by the apostles. It's not just a visionary encounter. So let's look at objection number 6. This goes back to that slide I had about another possibility. So maybe the disciples, the apostles, thought Jesus didn't appear to them physically. Maybe it was just an apparition. And maybe they just described it as a physical resurrection, but really it was an apparition. So apparition is a word that's used for physical or visual, paranormal, related manifestations of deceased loved ones, such as ghosts. This is talked about in great detail in Dale Allison's book, Resurrecting Jesus. There's no doubt people in the ancient world were familiar with apparitions, and some people today, when loved ones die, they try to come together and try to talk in a circle in some way to bring back the loved one, and they think maybe they're seeing an appearance of their loved one. Of course, it's a ghostly figure of some kind, and that can happen when people are grieving and they think they see a manifestation of their loved ones. So maybe the disciples described Jesus as a physical Jesus, but really it was some sort of ghostly figure. Well, Allison goes on to say, he talks about the relationship or the similarities between apparitions and the resurrection. He says here, the resurrection appearances and apparitions are both seen and heard. The resurrection appearances and the apparitions are seen now by one person and later by another. And in some cases, the resurrection appearances and apparitions are seen by more than one participant at the same time. The resurrection appearances and apparitions appear to individuals who did not know them in life. And the resurrection appearances and apparitions create doubt in some of the recipients. And then the resurrection appearances and apparitions offer reassurance and give comfort. Also, the resurrection appearances and apparitions give guidance and make requests or issue imperatives. And the resurrection appearances and apparitions are overwhelmingly real and seem solid. However, there are differences in Jesus' resurrection and apparitions, and this is talked about in O'Collin's book here on Christology. He says here, Jesus' disciples concluded he was physically raised from the dead, whereas witnesses of apparitions conclude the person is a disembodied spirit. Number 2, Jesus predicted his resurrection, whereas apparitions do not make such predictions. Thirdly, Jesus made great claims to personal authority, but people appear as apparitions do not. Of course, Jesus died a violent death, whereas people who appear as apparitions usually died a normal death. Fifth, of course, the disciples proclaim the resurrection, but those who see apparitions usually do not tell anyone about it. And then sixth, Jesus' tomb was discovered empty, but the tombs of those who appear as apparitions do not have empty tombs. So there are some differences with the apparitions and the resurrection of Jesus, but as I said, it seems that to point to an apparition, you'd have to say it's some sort of visionary experience or some sort of ghostly figure. And we know the evidence seems to point to there was a bodily, physical resurrection. Now, the visionary explanation is definitely related to the hallucination hypothesis. This is objection number 7. This is the number one hypothesis the skeptics put forward, along with the visionary one, very similar. And skeptics assert the disciples or followers of Jesus were so emotionally involved with Jesus' messianic expectation that their minds projected hallucinations of the risen Lord. So it is true that sometimes hallucinations do occur in situations of bereavement when someone's grieving. Sometimes people might think they see their deceased loved one in a chair or somewhere in front of them because they're grieving, and they may want to see him so badly or her so badly. They may see someone they think is their deceased loved one in like a ghostly sense or a visionary sense. And so that would be more of like an apparition probably. But the problem is, if you're going to punt to hallucination, you're going to have to say that the disciples or the apostles had a group hallucination. And that means all these appearances here in various locations and various groups. There's no way you can just say it's an individual hallucination, because these are all group sightings, at least what's recorded in the Gospels and Paul's letters. And so the problem is with group hallucination in the field of psychology, there's not a lot of common agreement. There is something called a group hallucination, whether there is something in the history of psychology as a group hallucination. And just a few things here. If a hallucination occurs in the mind of an individual and has no external reality, it's very hard for one person to participate in another person's hallucination. So also, if they did experience a group hallucination, they would have probably experienced it in different modes, such as one might have said, I see Jesus over by the door, or another one would say, no, I see him floating by the ceiling, or another one might say, no, I hear him speaking to me, or another may say, I only sense that he's in the room with us. So if you did have a group hallucination, it's very difficult for one person to participate in that hallucination, even to have a group hallucination. So, and then if you did have a group hallucination, there is some criteria in psychology of what would have to happen if it even did exist. And when it comes to a group hallucination, you would have to have these criteria. One would be you would need an expectation. That means that the group is expecting this thing to happen ahead of time. For example, the disciples would need to be expecting that Jesus was going to rise from the dead. You know that they were not. If you read the Gospels, it doesn't seem they're waiting for it in any sense. Secondly, it doesn't seem they're emotionally excited in any way. They're not sitting around saying, oh, I can't wait for Jesus to rise from the dead. We're waiting, waiting, waiting. And then thirdly, they must be informed beforehand in their literature, something in their past history or something within the Old Testament, something that would tell them the Messiah is going to rise from the dead. And we know that there's very little evidence that anywhere in the Jewish literature that the Messiah was going to rise from the dead. Not a lot of messianic expectations that the Messiah was going to rise from the dead. So even if there is a group hallucination, it doesn't really meet these criteria at all. And of course, finally, it's very hard to psychoanalyze someone in the past. You can maybe do it in the present, but it's very hard to try to get into their minds about what they actually saw and try to psychoanalyze them. So that's very tricky. Now, if someone says, well, it's possible they hallucinated, they certainly can do that. But remember, you can throw out all the possibilities you want. The issue is the evidence for such possibilities. And just because something is possible doesn't make it reasonable. Let's look at objection number 8. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Of course, I've heard this one before. And in this case, someone may say that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The claim that Jesus rose from the dead, of course, is an extraordinary claim. Thirdly, therefore, any evidence supporting it ought to be extraordinary as well. Fourth, I would say that most people that say this, they're not really sure what they mean by extraordinary. And fifth, no matter what kind of evidence you give them, it's probably not going to work Therefore, they'll never be convinced that Jesus rose from the dead. So in this objection, there's an equivocation issue on defining what we mean by extraordinary, and that leads to the issue of evidence. And of course, I would say that they are correct that the claim about Jesus rising from the dead is not an ordinary claim. Jesus rising from the dead is a unique claim, and it's a miracle, and it only happens once, because miracles are one-time events and they're unrepeatable, generally speaking. And so they are correct that it is not an ordinary claim. However, they do equivocate on the word extraordinary. And so if an extraordinary claim means it's something that is non-natural, then it must be shown that natural laws are immutable. However, as we know, natural laws are not immutable because they're descriptions of what happens, not prescriptions of what must happen. As far as we know, natural laws do not cause anything. They only describe what happens in nature. And secondly, we must differentiate between the difference between deductive reasoning, which is a priori looking at something, and inductive reasoning, which is looking at something after seeing the evidence. So if you decide ahead of time that many of the events in the New Testament, such as the resurrection, are not possible because of an a priori commitment to naturalism, which we'll talk more about in a minute, it will definitely impact in how you interpret the evidence. So that leads to the next objection, which is kind of related to the last one. A naturalistic answer is always a more probable explanation. In this case, we get into the issue of ontology and epistemology. Of course, ontology is a study of reality, and epistemology is a study of knowledge. So if someone believes that nature is all there is, and the New Testament records invoke things such as miracles and resurrections or non-natural explanations, that would certainly create a problem in what they can really know about Jesus. And we need to remember that when someone says the natural material world is all there is, that is a metaphysical claim or an ontological claim. And then if they turn around and say they're making that claim because science has shown it to be true, that is an epistemological claim. And in the end, that's really a circular argument because science is the study of the natural and physical material world anyway. And so science presupposes methodological naturalism. It presupposes that before they even do an experiment. And there's been more than enough books written on a defense of miracles and responses to David Hume and other things, so you can get some of these books if you're hearing objections to miracles. Of course, worldview commitments play a huge role in how one interprets the resurrection. For example, look at James Tabor here. He says that women do not get pregnant without a male ever, so Jesus had a human father. Dead bodies don't rise. So if the tomb was empty, the historical conclusion is simple. Jesus' body was moved by someone and likely reburied in another location. So there we go. We see an a priori commitment to naturalism, and that's going to influence how he understands the resurrection events in the New Testament. Same with John Dominic Crossan. He says here, a person has the right to say that I by faith believe that God has intervened in the resurrection event. It is a theological presupposition in mind that God does not operate in that way. So there we see his a priori commitment to naturalism to begin with. Said that in his debate with William and Craig in the book, Will the Real Jesus Stand Up? We need to remember, of course, that all historians have worldviews, biases, and presuppositions. A historian may say, given it is unlikely that a cow can jump over the moon, a dead person who has been buried 3 days can rise to life is just as unlikely. And so the bedrock of the principle of probability is one's sensory perception, personal experience, and reflection on historical investigations of the past. So we just need to remember that if you're going to go ahead and say the naturalistic explanation is the most probable one, then it's the burden of proof is on you to show why naturalism explains all features of reality and why miracles are off the table and why there is no God who can act in history. So let's look at number 10. This is another psychological explanation or objection. It's called the cognitive dissonance objection. This has gained some traction. In the cognitive dissonance objection, this phenomenon of cognitive dissonance begins with an expectation arising out of a deep longing or yearning for some particular state of affairs that is followed by disappointment of that expectation. So if we apply that to the New Testament resurrection story, we would say that number 2, the group cannot reconcile itself to the fact that its deepest yearning has been disappointed. So it perpetuates a state of denial, then provokes it to reorganize its view of reality to conform to the denied state of affairs. So basically what this boils down to is number 3, the disciples experienced cognitive dissonance. They thought that Jesus was going to restore the kingdom of Israel. They thought he wasn't going to die. They thought that a dying Messiah was horrific, and they were disappointed about that messianic outcome, and therefore they had to reorient their reality. They had to reconcile the dissonance. And so by reconciling the dissonance, they basically invented the resurrection story into their reality, and that is how they added converts to their ranks. Of course, there's all kinds of problems with this. For the cognitive dissonance theory to be applicable to the resurrection claim, it would mean that there's no physical raised Jesus, and out of their deepest longing for Jesus to be the Messiah, the disciples invented a non-existent resurrection out of their need to help them cope with their disappointment from the crucifixion. So, secondly, this would no doubt take us back to the problems with the visionary hypothesis and the hallucination hypothesis. It means that they didn't really see a raised Jesus. They just did so subjectively, or else they hallucinated. And then they made up the resurrection accounts. And of course, you would have an issue with an empty tomb. To have to deal with that issue, that means there's not a real body in the empty tomb. Skeptics would have to say they made that up as well. Of course, they do believe they made it up as well because they're hyper-skeptical. And then, of course, you'd have to ask what happened to Paul. How would cognitive dissonance explain Paul? Because Paul had no desire to follow Jesus from the beginning. He was a persecutor of the early followers. And then why did the disciples pick the resurrection category? If they're going to invent something, why not say Jesus was an apparition like a ghost? Or perhaps he was just translated to heaven. That's another category Jews had. Maybe he was just taken up to heaven directly and there was no physical appearances. So you've got some issues here to explain. I don't think the cognitive dissonance theory is very strong, but some skeptics like to point to that as well. Now, if someone does not believe, remember, if there is a God who can speak into the world of history and through a written record, then you're going to have a hard time talking about the resurrection, because we believe, of course, God has intervened into the world of history. And so that just goes back to the issue of a lot of these skeptical objections have to do with the fact they don't believe there is a God who can speak into history anywhere. So you may have to establish whether it's plausible that God could speak into history if he wanted to. Let's go over number 11. The 11th objection, we can't trust a burial story. And of course, a burial story has always been under attack as well. We need to remember that the importance of Jewish burial, because in Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 to 23, it talks about when someone is convicted of a crime and they're remaining on a tree, or you hang them on a tree and that person is out in broad daylight, we know that if that body is still there before nightfall, we know that's going to defile the land, because that's what Jews believe, that dead bodies on the land would defile the land. So that's why they have to cleanse the land, because it is defiled. It talks about this in Ezekiel and Jeremiah and other passages. So there's this emphasis on proper burial and upon not defiling the land. And so when it comes to Jesus's crucifixion, of course, he was hung on that execution stake. And in Roman crucifixion, of course, many bodies were hung out there for many hours, so they'd be a deterrent and cause other people not to commit crimes against Rome. In many cases, a body would go unburied. It would just rot and be picked apart by birds and animals. And then the issue becomes whether there was an argument or whether there's anything in Roman literature that would allow the body to be taken down and be given a proper burial like the Jews knew about or wanted. So in Jewish burial practice, of course, burial took place the day of death, or if death occurred at the end of the day or during the night on the following day. And following the death, the body is washed and wrapped. Of course, we can find this custom mentioned in several episodes in the Gospels and elsewhere. We see it in the story of Lazarus, who was bound and wrapped in cloths. We see the body of Jesus is wrapped in a clean linen shroud. Of course, Ananias is wrapped in Acts 5:6 and also in Acts 9:37. So we have this emphasis on proper burial. And then when it comes to the issue of dealing with Pilate and Joseph of Arimathea, who's the one that comes forward that wants to grant Jesus a proper burial, we need to understand during that time Passover was going on, which is a central event in Jewish history, a central event in that time going on right there. And Pilate knows that the issue, the background of Jewish proper burial, and he knows that most likely he does not want to create an uprising or create problems or create a riot. And so during that time of Passover, it could be that he wants to keep the peace, and he allows Pilate, or he allows Joseph of Arimathea to bury Jesus, to give him a proper burial, and he knows that it'd be better off to let Joseph take Jesus off to give him a proper burial. And so that's one way to look at it, that very well could happen. And of course, what happens is the skeptics come along and attack the the proper burial account. They say the Romans would have thrown his body to wild animals. This was kind of put forward by John Dominic Crossan in 1994. He argued that Roman law, given what we know about Roman practice, would take the bodies of crucified victims and just let them, or cast them into a nearby ditch where they would be eaten by dogs. Of course, there was a lot of responses to this, and there's a lot of problems with this, and that was way back in 1994. I think Bart Ehrman follows this hypothesis as well. But Crossan's arguments were found problematic. There is Roman legal material that states that the bodies of those executed, if request is made, can be taken down and given a proper burial. We know that our surviving literary evidence suggests that the bodies of those who are executed in or around Jerusalem during peacetime are not only permitted to be buried, but were expected to be buried before sundown on the day of death. We know that this was done to preserve the purity of the land, as outlined in Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 to 23. And we have Josephus that talks about in his writings that even the bodies of those sentenced to be crucified could be taken down and buried before sunset. And then we had the crucifixion victim. We found the remains of a crucifixion victim in 1968. They found this in an ossuary, which is a bone box. That means this victim was given a proper burial of some kind. He wasn't just thrown into a ditch. It's very similar to Jesus's crucifixion. So this put a little dent in that theory as well, seeing that there could be a proper burial given to a crucifixion victim. And so as far as the account that the burial story is false, most skeptics just totally reject the gospel accounts of the Joseph of Arimathea story. Burden of proof's on them to show why it's unreliable. And remember, Joseph of Arimathea was part of the Sanhedrin, the same group that ordered Jesus' execution. And so why would the gospel authors invent Joseph of Arimathea when he was part of the original crowd that ordered that execution? Jody Magnus, who's a Jewish scholar, she's a secular Jewish archaeologist, she says here, there's no need to assume that the gospel accounts of Joseph of Arimathea offering Jesus a place in this family tomb are legendary apologetic. The gospel accounts of Jesus' burial appear to be largely consistent with the archaeological evidence. She does digs in Israel. She's got a whole website you can check out as well. And this would be an example of what a rock-cut tomb was that Jesus was buried in. Joseph of Arimathea was a rich man. He could afford a rock-cut tomb, and of course he buried Jesus in his family tomb, a rock-cut tomb. Jesus's family was poor, and they would not be able to afford this. And so that's an example of what a rock-cut tomb would look like. All right, objection number 12, the genre. That's the type of literature. The genre of the Gospels are historical fiction. And so some people say the Gospels or other parts of the New Testament are myth, meaning they're just half-truth, folklore, fantasy, or fictionized accounts of history. Richard Burridge's book, What Are the Gospels, was the book that really changed the paradigm, set a paradigm on that issue. He talked about in his dissertation, or talked about how in his research the Gospels are an ancient biography and they contain the words and deeds of an historical person. Of course, there's been other books that have come out since then that show the Gospels are historical biographies as well, different kinds of, they've expanded on this issue as far as Burridge's work. Another book that has come out is Richard Bauckham's second edition of Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. He thinks the Gospels are a unique form of testimony. Obviously, we know things from the past through testimony, but he thinks they are a unique form of history where they are related to testimony. And so if you get both of those books or just read through them, I highly doubt you're going to come away thinking the genre of the Gospels are strictly some sort of fantasy or folklore. Most of the people that say that, once again, have a bias against the miraculous, and it comes from a worldview issue. Objection number 12, you're trying to use the New Testament documents to show the resurrection happened. They're biased and can't be trusted. Well, let me say this. Remember that when historians use the New Testament to talk about what happened with Jesus, they're looking at them as just like other ancient documents, like other works from antiquity. And so, of course, there was no New Testament at the time of Jesus. But historians can use the New Testament documents because they can just weigh them, use historical testing with them just like they do with anything else in history. So to just blow them off initially because they're written by the New Testament authors is incredibly simplistic. And even those that have problems with the New Testament documents, saying that there's parts of them that are unreliable, such as Bart Ehrman, even many of those scholars even agree with the historical bedrock, which is talked about in Mike Lacona's book here. They still agree that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. They still agree that the disciples thought they experienced Jesus in a resurrected sense after he died. They believe there were resurrection appearances to them. And of course, they believe Paul came to faith through what he interpreted as a post-resurrection appearance to him as well. So if you're going to go ahead and just blow it off, just because you think that it's written by the New Testament authors themselves, then remember, many scholars still agree with the historical bedrock. Objection number 13, all that matters is that we get existential meaning out of the resurrection. That means it's irrelevant whether Jesus factually rose from the dead. So in this thinking, it doesn't really matter whether Jesus physically, bodily rose from the dead. All that matters is we get meaning and hope out of the resurrection. Now, some Christians believe this as well, and some liberal New Testament scholars believe this as well. I saw a debate once where one scholar said to William Lane Craig, he doesn't care whether Jesus physically rose from the dead. All that matters is we get meaning and hope and something very powerful and transformational out of the resurrection. Of course, that gets into the issue of what is literal and what's figurative in the Bible. Some people may ask you, do you take the Bible literally, especially about the resurrection? Well, remember, if the original authors believe that Jesus physically rose from the dead in a literal physical sense, then that's what we would probably want to believe as well. But remember, literal approach doesn't ignore symbols, figurative language, hyperbole, illustrations, apocalyptic literature, things like that. It doesn't take everything hyper literally, but it certainly does take into account what the original authors believe. And it seems that the original authors did believe that Jesus physically rose from the dead in a factual sense, in a bodily sense. Objection number 14, we need to have present day analogies for the resurrection. So in this case, the argument goes like this. If we don't have any contemporary experience of the resurrection of a dead person, we have good reasons for believing that no dead man has ever been raised. So therefore, the past can only be known in terms of what happens in the present. And just because we don't see people rising today in our current day, that means that it probably didn't happen in the past. There's all kinds of problems with this. Because if we can only believe things that happened in the past because they're happening on a regular basis in today's world, then we probably end up rejecting several things from the past. Of course, science is a study of the past, and science believes all kinds of things happened in the past that they weren't there to see or observe directly. And they're, of course, studying unique, one-time, unrepeatable events. The beginning of life and the start of the universe were unique, one-time, repeatable events. And what science does, it makes an inference off those things and comes up with the best explanation for those things that happened in the past. And then, of course, we make the best inference to what happened, and then we do that with history as well. And then finally, number 15, I simply don't know if Jesus rose from the dead. I would just simply remain agnostic about it. I hear this a lot. Well, this is just another way of saying I don't want to know, because if you do actually come to the conclusion Jesus rose from the dead, it calls for a commitment of your life to Jesus. And also, we need to ask how you define knowledge. What does it mean to know Jesus rose from the dead? Because that's what you're saying, is that you don't have knowledge Jesus rose from the dead, and you'll just remain agnostic. As we've said before, almost all historical evidence, science, and cold case investigations are built on circumstantial or indirect evidence. So if you're not open to circumstantial, indirect evidence, then you would know a lot of things in science or cold case investigations. Also, we utilize what's called inference to the best explanation. That means we make inferences by collecting the data, then drawing conclusions on the basis of that evidence and we compare potential explanations, determine which is the best explanation and which is the most reasonable inference. And of course, the best explanation will cover all the data. And so whatever explanation you come up with would need to explain Jesus's appearances to many individuals, groups after he died, what happened to Paul, who was once a persecutor, became a follower of Jesus, what's the best explanation for the empty tomb, why James, once an unbeliever, came to faith in Jesus, how and why the Jesus movement got started and continued to on the death. After the death of Jesus, most likely it wouldn't have continued because most Jews would not follow a crucified Messiah. And then finally, why the early followers of Jesus changed their devotional practice to include Jesus, where he was worshipped and honored and prayed to, whereas in their monotheism that was a no-no, and now they seem to have taken a shift in their devotional practice. Remember, whatever explanation you come up with cannot be ad hoc. You can make up all kinds of things. If you want, means that a lot of people will assert things. I see this a lot of times. People assert things like maybe aliens raised Jesus from the dead, or maybe the disciples ate some bad mushrooms and freaked out. But that's not evidence. Evidence is not the same thing as assertion. So you can come up with an assertion, but you need to provide evidence for your assertion. So these are some of the objections that are out there. I know for many of you, you may not encounter some of these, but remember the resurrection is a central claim of our faith, and I hope that this will further equip you to engage people on it. You need to be confident. You need to have some good reasons for why you think Jesus rose from the dead. As I said, we can't have absolute certainty, but we can make the most reasonable inference. And we do believe the resurrection of Jesus explains the data than some of these other naturalistic possibilities that we have mentioned here. So have a good day, and just remember, he is risen.